My name is Maggie Lee. I'm coming from WWF International, and it's my pleasure to share with you a little bit of what we're doing in terms of conservation impact information or data transparency. To be honest, that's not really a lot compared with what I've heard from the rooms and also from the sessions. So there's just so much more that we conservation people or tree huggers or pandas, as we call ourselves, should learn from you. And so without further ado, let me just quickly get started. WWF, not the wrestlers, but the people who we call pandas, actually date all the way back. If you've seen the series called The Crown, has anyone seen the series? Oh, okay, that's quite a lot. I'm surprised. So I'm actually a big fan of the series. They mentioned WWF at least 2 times in the series. That's also because Prince Philip, the late Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh, used to be our patron for WWF. And so back when we first started, he was actually called to actually become one of the sponsors of this organization. And we spun off so many different NGOs in the past. Many of the environmental standards that you may know, FSC, MSC for seafood, they're all from WWF. And so we are active in nearly 100 countries. This is comparable to the likes of World Vision, Oxfam. They operate in far more countries, but we also have quite a lot of work to do with them as well. Save the Children is one of our global partners. We have over 5 million supporters, which means that most of this money that we operate from are actually donations. We do have grants, and that's actually creeping up a lot more now. We see that there's a lot more money coming in from grants and sponsorships, and especially corporate sponsorships. So we have 30 million social media followers. We tend to see this as a way to say that, hey, I'm green. I want to share with you something green on my Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or wherever today. And so we're very happy about that. And we see that there are more supporters of environmental movements recently. And so, of course, our mission is actually not just to save wildlife. It may appear to some people that because we have wildlife in our name in the US and Canada, where I'm from, and that we have a panda as our logo. And so that's also why we're the wildlife guys. Well, that is technically true, but we operate in much more areas than just wildlife conservation. And so we are actually trying to get people and the environment to live in harmony. That's really what it is in a nutshell and in plain English. The long version is there. So myself, I introduced myself earlier today, someone from the private sector doing some evil deeds, coming into the conservation area to redeem myself, hopefully. And I do quite a lot of data analyses and also work a lot with data transparency. So the goal of this session is really, just as I mentioned, to get us talking, really, and so that we can learn from you. Conservation is very behind, as I mentioned earlier. We have a lot to learn from other parts of civil society. I hope to explore the common obstacles and challenges that you experience in your work in explaining or also calculating and tallying impact. So how are we doing that as a whole in civil society? And also any potential areas for collaboration and synergy. Can we have, let's say, reverse coaching session or sorry, a coaching session where we learn from you? How are you actually translating the money that goes into your conservation, or sorry, into your organization and becoming impact? How do you translate that? And also any innovations. I was at the ChatGPT session for a little while. Unfortunately, I had a call right before that, but I rushed right in and I thought it was so interesting. And ChatGPT just announced their 4.0, is it? And so it is exciting times that we can actually have different tools, different ways to work together. And so hopefully we can learn that today. As Lord Kelvin puts it, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And as people who are change makers, all of us here, we really are trying to change things, and we're trying to improve the way we change things. So what goes on in conservation organizations, right? Do we go hug trees? Well, that's some of the conservation societies, right? WWF doesn't necessarily do that. And so we operate kind of like a black box to many people because we don't know what goes on with what you do for the animals. Okay, so we don't just work with animals, as mentioned. So quite a lot of money comes in from donations, as mentioned. The most actually from face-to-face donations. That's actually a surprise to many people, because you would think that nowadays it's usually the ongoing monthly supports or the credit card transactions online that gives us our money. But interestingly, our face-to-face donations tend to rake in a lot more money than most other things. But as mentioned just now, AIDS grant sponsorships go up now because of a lot more government spending on environment. And also intergovernmental bodies such as the ones I work for, UNEP, they sponsor quite a lot of work of WWF as well. And then it goes into this black box called conservation. Some magic things happen, and then out comes positive environmental impact. And so the first bit, as we see it, right, the first bit here is covered by IATI. So we know that there's actually money coming in, money going into specific countries for specific projects. WWF is not yet a member, but we are an author of IATI. And so we're hoping to actually do more. At this time, I don't think we have actually the capacity to become a member just yet. Hopefully we will soon. But after this part, we don't know what goes on. And to be honest, some of us who are working for WWF also don't know what's going on. WWF is a very complex organization. We do have so-called franchises. The brand is being franchised in different countries. And so if you're looking at, let's say, China, Japan, Canada, these are big countries and they do have their national organizations. Whereas some of the smaller countries, smaller by size of the country or sometimes by the size of their economy, they have country offices that are under WWF International, which is the organization I work for. And so each office has a different way to measure impact. And that's how complex this problem I have is. And so in reality, we think of things as donations, AIDS, grants, sponsorships, right? In reality, we have so many different types of funding coming into conservation, and that conservation is done differently in different ways for different projects. We have influencing, policy influencing projects where we talk to the governments. We have quite a lot to do with on-ground conservation. We get communities to do the work. We teach them how to conserve the forest. We teach them how to do anti-poaching for wildlife. There are sustainable fisheries. So we work with companies. And so many different things that we do in conservation. And so each one of them would produce a different way of measuring how successful they are, because there's just so many different types of projects, and out goes a myriad of different ways to measure our impact. And so we have so many of the different units, and I believe that each one of us seated would have a variety of these as well. Of course, what your organization does is actually also quite complex. In conservation, we have the same problem, and now we have really no way of equating that. I don't think we're trying to equate that. We're just trying to see where we're at this point. And so it's regrettable that we're only at this stage, but we're getting started. That's the good news. And so some of the common obstacles and challenges is that I mentioned the varied units of measurement, difficulty in achieving baseline definitions. It's very difficult for us to produce baseline data because of the reasons I mentioned before. There's just such a variety of things, and also sometimes we require a lot of access permissions. So governments need to provide us with the access to go measure things or to use satellite imaging for things that we can use that for. And also the granularity of information or data usually does not actually match what we need to calculate conservation. So we're not the only actors there. A good example is that people say that vitamin C is good for you. How do we know that? Because people say so, right? So, but how do you know that? How do you know vitamin C is good for your skin, good for your body, good for your immune system? We can't isolate a single factor from your food, let alone a single factor from what's going on in the environment. It's so complex that even if we actually calculate all the different types of impact coming in from different projects, we can never isolate what are we doing collectively, let alone for one single project. It's like having a gazillion people talking about vitamin C. It does different things for different people. And we talk about animals, we talk about bacteria, we talk about the rivers, we talk about pollution. Add that into the equation and you see what I mean here. And so some of this information that we're talking about is also highly geospecific. It will change as we cross the border for something, just like what you would do in your lines of work as well. But we don't see we don't see political borders. So the environment does not stop where your country ends, right? It's actually going on and on across, and we evaluate things differently. There may be a different system across the border, and we have trouble actually attaining that. There's a different definition. And so as the environment, as I mentioned, it's actually so vast, and that we have so many different cross-regional and global cooperations that it's extremely difficult for us to define how to actually work together at this point. So these are some of the challenges that I can name, but of course, there's so many more. Potential areas for collaboration with you. How can we actually do conservation monitoring, evaluation, and data transparency, learning from you all? How did you overcome that first hurdle? For example, working with different projects that are similar in essence in the same areas. How did you actually start doing that? How did you initiate this type of work that aligns impact? And how can we adopt lessons from, let's say, even the private sector about productivity? Okay, how successful are we at doing what we do? And also different subsectors of civil society, including the ones that I mentioned, but of course, including everyone here in the room. So one specific thing that I think we can actually really work on is alignment of impact definition. There's quite a lot of forms, as I mentioned before. There are ones that are specific to environmental work. So for example, the area of protected land or protective conservation area, or the amount of seascapes that we are able to actually declare as no-go zone for fisheries. So those are very specific. Whereas we have more and more things that we're dealing with communities, with people, as we know now. We now have learned that conservation can't be done in a vacuum. We have to involve the locals. And now we're waking up to the fact, unfortunately, it's very late. But what are you doing in terms of measuring impact for public advocacy, for education? It could be education of your rights. It could be education of how to prevent more logging in the area. It could be a very big variety of things that we can educate in. So some of these areas are actually where I feel that we have a lot of overlap, and that conservation can really learn from each one of the particular subsectors of civil society. And then indicators and outcomes. I won't go through this in detail, but how are you actually establishing your indicators and outcomes? What are the challenges and what are the ways to define success? How do you actually spot out a good indicator from a bad one? Of course, we know SMART goals, right? So things that need to be measured, things that actually have a specific unit. But what else is there that we don't know? We don't know what we don't know. And then there's a little bit of good news, okay? So we're not all in the dark, okay? So conservation is not just a bunch of idiots trying to hug trees. There are people who are trying to make changes to this. And so some of the ones here shown on the lower left are some of the larger conservation organizations that came together to actually come together with a conservation standard, which is developed and tested to refine what conservation really means. I won't go into detail about this, but this is actually an overall global effort, and they're meeting regularly to define how conservation views things. You see, conservation has their own little group here, and you are in a different group. And so that's also why I'm trying to bridge these two things, is that when we learn from other conservation organizations, can we also learn from you? And that this is really the goal of this session. And lastly, we mentioned some of the sexy buzzwords just right now. ChatGPT being one of my favorites. It really does magic for a lot of things like grant proposals, like producing reports. How do we actually use some of the things that seemingly are still out of reach for civil society into what we do in terms of just data, transparency, and reporting? Even for data stewardship, there's so much that we can actually learn from private sector. We may say that we don't have the same amount of funding in how we actually govern data, but then who knows? There may be different projects coming in. So maybe there would be a funder or donor who would actually sponsor this type of work, and also organizational development in terms of how to deal with data. And so hopefully we can also get your thoughts on this. I'm going to try to quickly come to this part, which is really what I'm here for. If I may open up the floor for the rest of my session, I don't know how long I have, but I'm hoping that we can get some thoughts, inputs, and suggestions from you. Thank you. Don't clap just yet. You need to talk. We're trying to get you to talk.
Should we take a seat? And then
yes.
Yeah, you can sit down. Yeah, I'll do it on the other side. You can just keep it with you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I think they have extra mics there,
Okay.
but I can pass it along just in case. Does anyone have questions for Maggie?
Questions or suggestions or comments? Please.
Great.
Oh, could you put?
Yeah, just a second. She's getting you the mic.
All right, I've got the microphone.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, hey,
Perfect.
what kind of extra information fields would you propose be added to IATI to improve reporting for environmental things?
That's a great question. For us right now, there's not much segregation between the types of projects that we lead. I think there would be it would be much welcomed if we have subcategories for conservation in terms of how we actually look into the types of work that's being done on ground. So that's some of the areas that we struggle to involve more people in WWF to use IATI. Many would actually really welcome that. And even at this current status of current ways of accessing IATI data, I think a lot of people can benefit. It's just that within the organization, few people know about it in the first place. And then once we actually get more into it, I'm hoping that we can also come back and propose ways that we can work closer together, such as adding fields.
We have another question there. Wait. Okay, let me get you a mic.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. No problem.
So Darren, I'm actually from the private sector. I'm just curious. The Belgian Impact Finance Week back in early December was really big on impact measurements. Do you have your own software internally to measure your own impact, or do you use external consultants? Just quite curious what a large organisation like yourselves use in that respect.
So for WWF, thanks for that question. For WWF, we don't operate as one gigantic organization. There are at least 3 different types of sub-organizations that are within WWF. I won't go into details about how we define things, but because of how we're actually jurisdictionally reporting to one another in terms of within the organization, some are independent and autonomous. And so they would actually have most likely a different way to measure impact. What we're trying to do right now is to build a common platform. And so that is a Herculean task because we have to pull in everybody from their existing systems. And so we do use different types of productivity platforms that are used by the private sector as well. So many of them are developed by the big corporations that help with these platforms that I have also used in the private sector. But right now, in terms of measuring impact, which is really what we really need to do, there's really no such way to do that at this point. There's many ways to collect information, but these databases tend to be very rudimentary and don't regard any of the distinctions of data. So that's why the data quality remains quite poor.
Yeah, as a follow-up question to that, you've actually worked with the private sector, then you moved on to UN and then the NGO world. What do you see are the main differences between, without causing controversy here?
Yeah,
So.
I mean, no controversy at all, but for-profit is for-profit. So you can measure in different types of currency. How much money are we making? And so it's pretty simple. Whereas conservation organizations, we can't do that. We can't just look at burn rates and how much are we actually spending in each country to say that, hey, we've been super successful because we burnt through 100% of the grant. We all know that. And so we can't just measure how many lives we saved because we can't say that. We can't measure it in any single unit. And so that's really one of the hardships of measuring impact in a conservation organization, versus private sector.
May I just add to that, just on the basis just of that experience in Belgium in the Impact Finance Week, a lot of organisations, just for the benefit of everybody else here that's wondering about impact measurement, it's really quite interesting for people like us externally to the sector. But there are impact measurement specialists that people tend to use externally. So just in case anybody's wondering about going down that avenue with their own organisation, there are specialists that exist, obviously also in academia, but externally to that. I thought I'd just add that as an ad-lib.
Thank you. So I had one more slide. That was just my email. I was hoping that if you don't have anything to like off the top of your head to actually propose or suggest, I would love it if you actually could contact me and also offer any of your advice. This is really what this session is for. It's a call for action for us to come together as not individual parts of civil society, but as one. Thank you so much for listening, and really hope to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Up next, we have Land Projects Database, and we have Romy Sato online. She is the Knowledge Network Coordinator at Land Portal Foundation. We also have Charles Tom Bayer here, the Land Information Management and Advocacy Consultant at Land Portal Foundation. And she would also be joined by Hema Betsema, Senior Program Advisor, Land at Scale. Over to you, Romy.
Thank you, Anand. You just saved me a few seconds with the introductions. Exactly, I just wanted to acknowledge that my colleague is also in the room, Charles Tom. Do not hesitate to grab him for any extra questions as well. And Hema Betsema, who is a key partner in this initiative, she's online with us and may come towards the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and the idea is also to have a conversation here. I could already see quite a few common aspects between Maggie's presentation and mine in terms of all the complexity of conservation, and that's the same with land governance issues. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our land projects database. As the name goes, is very specifically focused on land governance topics. Next slide, please. So first of all, just quickly about Land Portal, who we are, what we do. We are an organization, a not-for-profit organization, and we are operating between the open data community and the land governance communities. So also trying to bridge now these two communities. Our mission is to enable an open, inclusive and democratic land information ecosystem to help decision-making at all levels. So what that means in practice is that we want to make knowledge about land issues more accessible, more open, more visible, and more nuanced. We have 3 pillars of work. The first one, called Inform, is basically focusing on improving the documentation and sharing of land knowledge, land data. The second one, on Open, is very much where we do our advocacy work in talking to partners in the land sector to have them trying to adopt more open data standards in sharing land information. And thirdly, our pillar on debate, which is basically for promoting discussions, debates on land topics, but also on opening up the land information ecosystem. Next slide, please. So under our second pillar, the open one, and for which Tommy, my colleague in the room, is leading on, we are tracking the state of land information. And within that, we are maintaining a global land projects database. And in November last year, very recently, we started a partnership with the Global Donor Working Group on Land to revamp this database. And Hema, who is online with us, is currently the chair of this group. Next slide, please. And this is where we come to, that I can tell you a little bit about our database, but first I need to tell you about this other database where everything started with. And for simplicity, I'm going to call it the donors map. So this story is that back in 2014, this group, the Global Donor Working Group on Land, which is a group of focal points from 29 donor agencies and intergovernmental organizations, they were asking themselves who's doing what and where on land issues, and how much is invested in land governance interventions. And they wanted to show the scope of land interventions to justify continued funding to land projects, but also to improve coordination. The problem is that back then, the model that they were adopting was a very tailored one and disconnected from other development data initiatives, and the data was added manually. So soon it became clear that within this group of focal points, there was low capacity to keep this database up to date. Next, please. And now we come to this initiative, which is basically to migrate the functions and the data from this donors map to our land projects database. And the difference is that our database is to a large extent adopting the IATI standards. We are retrieving both data from the donors map, but also some other records which are manually added. Now, we want to include the IATI data into this database and only have IATI data in the future. The model that we are developing now and together with this group is we are trying to avoid the duplication of reporting, obviously, because donors have to report anyways to IATI, or they are doing it. So it is basically taking advantage of IATI to provide this overview of land interventions. At the same time, it also allows for better coordination across data platforms and obviously across the donor agencies in their land projects. Finally, we want to make sure that the data is open, it's reusable, and we are also going to be doing the curation of all these projects there. Next, please. So what we have done so far, and you can go to the next one. Yeah, so land governance, similar to conservation, is also a complex issue. Now we also have to look into different thematic areas to retrieve projects and interventions that are also related to land issues, land rights. So what we have done so far is the data selection, and with that we have used a list of 32 keywords to navigate into the IATI data store, and we retrieved from there with this list of keywords to over 2,000 projects. And now we also have, of course, we have to add to that the over 1,000 projects that are coming originally from the donors map and the land portal. Next one, please. Right now we are at the curation phase. So we are dealing here with a spreadsheet of over 3,000 records, and now to a certain extent trying to automate certain tasks related to the curation, but also to find and eliminate duplicates, to check for thematic relevance, particularly from the projects ingested or retrieved from IATI, and trying also to fill the data gaps, dealing with the translation issues. There are quite a few records that we noticed in IATI that, of course, they are published in other languages. Maybe the title is in English, but the descriptions is in Swedish, Norwegian, other languages. And also dealing with the issues of currencies, since the idea in the future is also to have a visualization tool. So we need to do some aggregation there. Next one, please. And very quickly on some preliminary findings of this curation is that obviously it is difficult to match the records that we have from IATI and the donors map, basically due to the fact that donors map were not, they were not necessarily using all the IATI standards. So some projects, they seem to be the same, but they have slightly different titles. So this is something that we have to deal with in our curation. Same thing with the formats, as I mentioned, for currencies, for languages. There are also some missing information, sometimes no dates, no budgets in both the data sets. But the advantage is that now with the IATI data, we are also able to give an overview, to retrieve information from other donors, from donors that are not necessarily within this group of focal points in the Global Donor Working Group on Land. For example, I mentioned here UNDP, Irish Aid, and UN Women. Next one, please. Finally, we will go through the ingestion phase. I foresee this taking place around July. We will then, of course, open this also for feedback and adjustments by the donors group, by the community. It's actually, right now, it's also the purpose of this session is also to already encourage some of this feedback into what we are doing. Again, into the ingestion phase, considering the open data standards that we want to adopt in this visualization tool, and developing a maintenance plan. Next one, please. Yes, and here we come to the end of this presentation, and it's also with the objective to learn from you. So I have a few questions here that came to mind, which would be really interesting to know in the room. If you have any other similar, if you know of any other similar initiatives, how do you deal with duplications in the IATI data, now particularly budget information? As I have noticed that since IATI members are composed of both donor agencies, but also a lot of implementing agencies, what happens when both the donor and the implementing agencies are reporting about the same project? So what is the experience aggregating, curating, visualizing the data? How do you monitor the usability or success of your tool? Yes, how do you incorporate feedback from your users, and any stories of impact advice for us? That would be really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romy. Just before your session, before lunch, we actually had a workshop on data issues. So you have highlighted some of the issues over there as well. I would highly recommend going back to the recording and take some ideas from the topics that were discussed there. I think some of your questions were actually dealt over there. So you might get the answers you're looking for.
Right.
Any questions for Romy? Or I can get started. You mentioned that you want to completely transition to IATI. Were there any specific donor-related information which was available on Donors Map as compared to IATI? Between the transition, you mentioned IATI has more donors and more information. What about the other way around?
Yes, I don't know if you mean also in terms of the specific records, projects that we are retrieving. Actually, we have a big task ahead of us now, because we also are realizing that with merging these two data sets, we realize that we are not being able to find the duplicates. So it means that the projects that the donors were adding to this tailored database, the donors map, is completely different, that data, from what we are seeing in IATI. And of course, this opens up a lot of questions for us. Is it that they were attributing different titles? Is it because maybe these were very large projects, for example, maybe sitting within conservation issues, maybe sitting within other larger programs, but there was a specific component on land tenure security, on land reforms, and maybe the ones reporting to this donors map, they were just trying to extract that very portion. So, which means that in the end, we don't have a match, right? So right now, what I see is that we are really having 3,000 records, 3,000 projects to visualize, trying to identify some duplications there, but so far, not really many.
Right. I see a comment here on the chat. Is it from one of the users? Just to clarify. Okay, great. It was already answered. What about other data sources? Do you rely heavily on these two? And how does that translate into creating a portal that your users want?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, the issue is that right now, for example, the land projects database that exists in Land Portal is mostly retrieving data from the donors map. But it's also open for anyone in our community to log in to the Land Portal and also suggest new projects to be added. And this is a model that will probably continue, but we really have to consider a few things here, because it's true that we are trying to present this data in the best possible way, as accurate as possible. And we see these issues about if it is the donor agency reporting, and at the same time, the implementing agency, how do you deal with that? Now, maybe the data is being, particularly for budgets, now it may give also a lot of misleading information that the budgets of certain projects will be double of what it is. So probably what we need to make to keep is also a process where we are coordinating this process and really analyzing the requests for adding new projects, so that it's a constant sort of curation work also, to be able to have a database that is accurate as possible.
Great. And who exactly are your users, and what is the impact you're trying to have with the portal on your users?
Mm-hmm. Well, the users of, I will answer this first portion of the question, and I think for the impact, I'll turn to Hema, my colleague here, from the Netherlands agency. So the users is very much, we consider the users of the donor the Land Portal in general. And we, through our surveys, we see that a lot of them are actually coming from the researchers in different levels. And here in research, we can also consider some students. But we also have a lot of people from governments and civil society organizations. Most of them, they are, yes, operating within the land community, but we also have a lot of people coming from other sectors, but that are interlinked with land issues. And I'll turn to Hema, perhaps to say a few words about impact or possible impact of this work.
Yeah, thanks, Romy. Yeah, and to answer this question, also coming from the perspective of the Global Donor Working Group on Land, as well as from the perspective of RVO, a Dutch government institution responsible for the management of a large land governance program, Land at Scale. Data is crucial in making sure that we coordinate our efforts globally, but particularly also in countries where we have projects and programming happening. And this improved coordination is indeed one of the priorities of the donor group at this moment. And with the current project with Land Portal, the data will be much more easily accessible, of course, but also more easy to analyze. The project will maybe provide interesting insights regarding the countries where many of us have projects and programs going on. It could lead to country-focused exchanges with donors, host governments, other in-country stakeholders. The same could apply for thematic exchanges. For example, bringing in different countries where activities are happening around a certain subtopic of land governance. So yeah, it has lessons learned aspects, potentially making our projects better, increasing their impact. It has a coordination element, preventing overlapping programming, finding synergies, and potentially towards the future could also support more collaborative programming from the very start. So yeah, we see quite some opportunities, at least from our side, in this collaboration. And yeah, as Romy mentioned, linking this with IATI provides a lot of benefits, whereas before, indeed, all of us were manually entering the project data and had to keep it updated, and that this was definitely a weakness of how we were doing it before.
Thank you, Hema. Manually entering data does sound tiring. Any questions? Yeah.
Yes. Actually, I was looking at the questions on the screen, and I was thinking the issue of duplication came up this morning. It keeps coming up. It does feel a little bit like Groundhog Day for some of us who've been coming to these meetings, because it is a crucial issue and it's one of the most important because of the way the data is published in IIT. But the good news is that there is actually a lot of guidance on this, and a lot of people who have been dealing with this and finding ways, methodologies. And so I think you would be able to find quite a bit of information. And also, this issue is central for all of the aid coordination platforms and efforts at country level. So I suspect you might learn a lot as well from how donor governments are dealing with that. But one practical suggestion, and I know it's been done to us, with us, is sometimes we've received lists of projects that were from Canada. I'm from Canadian government. Receive a list of projects, and we're being asked to reconcile them, and that's completely fair, because if we're putting data out and we're not providing the easy way for traceability, like providing the source of funds and the numbers and all of that, which is what we're all supposed to do, then I think it's fair to say we have these 25 projects and we're not sure whether or not they're the same. Usually we're able to say that very quickly, or reasonably. So that could be one way, at least, to deal with some of that and distribute the workload a little bit. And I wanted to come back finally on the issue of visualization of the data. I mean, the type of projects you're dealing with leads really, the natural way to visualize the data is on maps. And I want to kind of put a call out. It's been a long time since we, in the community, had discussions around geolocation, how to code it, how the data needs to be done, and why, and what the various elements of IATI standard mean. But we also really need to be working on how do you put this on maps, especially when the coding is done for entities rather than specific points, which is very often more relevant, but is also way more difficult to put on maps in a way that makes sense. I would really, really hope that maybe at the next community event we can have discussions around that, and even solutions would be.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I'll make that note. We are gonna create maps next time for sure. Would you like to go next? Could you just mention your name and which organization?
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Romy, for the presentation. My name is Kayode. I work with KOICA, Korea International Cooperation Agency, the country office from Nigeria. So I think I find the presentation very helpful, because for a country like Nigeria, land information is quite, it's not really at the level we want it to be. So having this kind of your organization, I see some possible benefits. So the questions will just go in a way to know if What's your relationship as an as a company with host government offices? So for instance, we have the Ministry of Lands in Nigeria. So do you necessarily source your data from there or from donors working on land projects in Nigeria? Thank you.
Anand, yeah, can I go ahead and answer some of these reactions? Yeah. Okay, thanks. So first of all, thank you very much also for the advice on the other sessions that took place and all the wealth of information that already exists. Indeed, we have not yet done our so much work in trying to retrieve all of that. And I do like the idea that I've seen in the IATI website how you are organizing a lot more of these community exchanges. No? And for me, this would be extremely helpful exactly to understand how others are doing with these applications, or how also this is dealt at the level of government agencies in countries. Yes. I think in terms of the comments also of the maps of how we need to be doing a better job in visualizing this data and most likely through the maps. To be honest, sometimes I have questions whether the maps are always going to be the go-tos, the best, or maybe it is still a very important type of visualization, but that needs to be complemented with other types of visualizations. No? We are at the same time also struggling with this, because also because of our mission to be an organization that advocates for open data, to be very open here with you all, we struggle because sometimes we want to provide this information in a way that it's very accessible to our community, and accessible not simply in terms of they can reuse that information, but also accessible in terms of understanding. And we see that for the better understanding of this data, the proprietary tools offer us a great efficiency, because these are tools like Esri that has already very good applications. Then you can easily input some data and you have great visualizations there. At the same time, we are trying also to explore other ways of doing it, but then we come into this challenge of coding. Now, it often, if you want to go completely open source, you have to have the capacity, really good set of skills in your team to be doing that. And this is really a challenge for us because we are a very small organization, and I can imagine for many other organizations having also this challenge. No? How do you keep true to your work and to your mission in really being completely, fully accessible, open, but also with the challenge of capacities for that. And thanks also for the comments from the colleague from COICA in Nigeria. In terms of, so for our work, and by the way, we are an organization and we are not a company, the data that we have is coming from the donors themselves. Most of it coming from this initiative that they had before, this database, where they were going to the back end of that system and adding information. And our relationship with governments is somewhat limited. And this is more specific also to the work that we do on the open up data sets on the land issues. It's great that you mentioned also the Ministry of Lands in Nigeria. And it's great also that my colleague Tommy is in the room. Please grab him to talk a bit more, because he is the one also leading on a type of work that we do on Land Portal. And that's where you have a more direct relationships with the governments. Summing up, this work is really about investigating the state of the land information there. So how open is land records, land tenure data, or land development type of data. and so on. But also trying to advise governments to make this information more accessible. So there you can also talk a bit more with Tommy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Romy. Would you like to go next? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Romy. This is Yvonne Ramos from the Government of Colombia. I work for the International Cooperation Agency. So my question is if you are just only taking data from ODA projects, or are you considering also South-South cooperation projects? Because I'm checking the website with the Colombian projects, and within the Latin American region, we are sharing a lot of experiences implementing projects and allocating a lot of resources for South-South cooperation in terms of providing technical assistance to other countries in terms of land rights, land tenure, land distribution. And if that kind of information is not visualized in this portal, so it will be just the ODA land portal. But if you want to become a land portal, you should include this kind of information. And if you need help with that, we can, of course, contact you with CEGIP, which is the organization in Ibero-American countries that we already have this project arrangements and the systematization of the contribution from the global south to this kind of sector. That's all.
You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. That's really great. Thanks for raising that. Please do write me. I have put my email on the first slide, I believe. Or I will also ask my colleague Tommy to get your contacts later on so we can be in touch. Indeed, right now, so the data that we have, as I said, it's coming from this initiative from the donors map. It's also open for individuals to contact us and to fill up like a form, which will transform into a data point that will be reflected in the platform. So it is open in that sense, absolutely. And also conceptually, of course, the idea is to be, as you said, a true land portal and not just the ODA land portal. The main reason why probably right now you mostly see ODA information is because it is the information that is coming from the donors map, which it is, as I said, a group, also a very specific select group that where you have 29 agencies represented there. So 29 is also a lot smaller, the number, than if you look at the whole IATI membership. My question back to you would be, is this information that you have in this network that you mentioned also being reported to IATI? Because that would be also a way for us to be able to retrieve this information, since the model initially, the model that we are conceiving now is to retrieve the information from IATI, assuming that the majority of organizations, groups in the development space are reporting to IATI. But if not, of course, we can always open individual doors, specific doors for other initiatives to also report to us. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I can.
Oh, sorry.
If I can add to you, Romy.
Sure.
I think this is one of the exciting things about working with Land Portal and linking up with IATI, that we can have that's added layer of information. And just listening to the presentation of WWF earlier this session, I realized that probably they have land governance related activities and projects as well. So I think, yeah, our work can only benefit if we know better who else is active and what could be our added value in addition to what everyone is already working on.
So you wanted to add?
Now, as far as I know, IATI only considers ODA, right? Not. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure which South-South cooperation projects are you taking information from? No, none? Okay, so we will discuss that. Yeah, but I mean, the information is out there. And in regards of the information of the South-South cooperation projects in Latin American region, it's already on the database. We are already have like an arrangement with CEGIP. And of course, if you need help with that, we can contact them.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Romy, Kema. And like she mentioned, you have Tom here in the room